think what this experience of COVID is teaching us is that we have to be more robust, certainly more vocal, in insisting that the exercise is actually the wrong way around. The exercise should be, you tell us why you should impose any restrictions on our ability to do the things we would expect to do. And that's not happening now. The border closure between New South Wales and Victoria, which for our international listeners is the latest this week and a very significant one. It's not unprecedented. During the Spanish flu, there were border closures. That was 100 years ago. So it's a very unusual event. If you go looking for the explanation, you will see it in a couple of very short paragraphs in a public health order that was issued by the New South Wales government. It doesn't really give you much comfort that all of the things I've been talking about, which is justify why these restrictions should be imposed, because the cost will be untold for many people. And again, I'm not here to argue that public health objectives cannot be important enough in any circumstances. It's just that I want to be assured and satisfied that our rights are not being simply displaced because senior bureaucrats and even politicians have decided, well, this is the way it's going to be. There needs to be some pressure on governments and officials and the bureaucracies that support them to justify the powers they exercise and also demonstrate to all of us that the least burdensome approach is being adopted. And that brings me to a second point, which I'll just finish off on. I think litigation in our superior courts is inevitable the longer this pandemic goes on. But it's also going to engage another question, which I don't think has been talked about all that much, and I know it will be relevant in other jurisdictions too, which is just compensation. If restrictions are effectively extinguishing the ability of people to operate businesses or other undertakings and they are suffering financial loss, I can certainly foresee that litigation will not be long away where people will be arguing, well, you impose these restrictions, and just like any other imposition on, say, a proprietary right or something similar, we have an entitlement to agitate a question before our superior courts about whether we're entitled to compensation for that. So those sorts of questions, though, hopefully will better inform the exercise of these broad powers. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I think that's the number.
Well, certainly I agree with you on the point that it is concerning that a lot of these restrictions are being made through essentially government fiat, through regulations or our US audience, executive orders that are not subject to the same measure of parliamentary scrutiny that legislation is. And I think that when we are talking about such dramatic imposition on Australians as border closures, that people in the border towns such as Albury and Wodonga are fundamentally changing the way that they go about their everyday lives, or the imposition of severe lockdown restrictions come to in a moment, that level of scrutiny is very important. You also touched on another issue which goes to a question. We've got a number of questions that we've been asked. A question was asked by Matthew Dean about Australians' fundamental rights according to the Constitution. And I think in answer to that question, the short answer is there are actually very few. We don't have a Bill of Rights or similar provision like the United States. There are very few concrete provisions in the Constitution that guarantee us as individuals rights. But Section 92, which I quoted earlier, is one of the few. And in that respect, surely it must be viewed as being one of the most fundamental in terms of the intention of the framers of the Constitution and those who adopted it. And that's why I certainly think this is an important issue. It probably won't get a fair shake, given the standing issue that I mentioned earlier and the nature of ongoing developments, but it is, from a principled standpoint, it's very important. But it does take me to another question, which I think, John, I might throw back to you, thoughts. In Victoria, we have gone it alone, so to speak, among the states by introducing a Charter of Human Rights, similar to that in somewhere like Canada. And we've already seen that there have been unintended consequences, the adoption of that charter, seen government decisions struck down. The one that springs to mind for me was the Certain Children's case in 2016, in which the government tried to gazette a wing of a maximum security prison as a youth justice facility after a number of riots, and that was found to be in breach of the Charter. We've seen in Melbourne recently, public housing towers gone under complete lockdown. We had 9, one of which is still under a quote hard lockdown, which the residents cannot leave. We've got the government sending in, at taxpayers' expense, methadone to people who have heroin addictions in that tower. We've seen them providing food and other essentials because those people are not at liberty to leave to get those essentials for themselves. And surely this has to raise some significant questions under the Charter. And I think that those questions are quite interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I also think it does, as I mentioned, it does show the danger of that sort of approach to rights.
Yes, certainly. And I've long been concerned about the Charter in Victoria. Like a lot of people watching and joining us today, I've got concerns in the modern age about bills of rights. So people who advocate a national charter, for example, in Australia, often liken it to the Bill of Rights in the United States, and I often make the point that we're talking about 2 very different ages, and the basis for the United States Bill of Rights is very different to the basis for modern charters, which, you know, to be quite frank, I think are more an exercise in what I call gerrymandering human rights. That is, you protect the rights that are more closely corresponding to the causes you vouch for. You know, I often made the point as a serving politician, I don't only represent the people who agree with me. And I meant that more as a question that in the area of human rights and equal opportunity, it's about preserving the sanctity and accessibility of the public square, not putting up checkpoints for people to come through. So I think that's a broad point I'd make about the Charter. And I looked at the government's, if you like, I would liken it to a crackdown on the public housing estates in Melbourne last week. And I made the same point publicly as I did a moment ago, which was that really the only option that government had, to simply lock down an entire area, putting aside the vulnerability of the residents, but closing off a whole estate, some parts of which were clearly unaffected by COVID-19 transmission data. There was no evidence that there were any transmissions in some of the units or some of the buildings. So again, I go back to that question. If the approach of governments who are trying to be faithful to the spirit, at least, of a charter, which is always ensuring that the exercise of government power does not unduly impede on people's rights, you ask, did they come at it from the basis that we're only doing the minimum necessary, or did they approach the task as in, we're going to exercise this power unless somebody can tell us that we've gone too far? And I think that latter approach is what debases the whole discussion around human rights.
Yeah, I'm certainly inclined to agree, and couldn't add anything to that very insightful commentary, John. Just before I end this half of the discussion and move on to my discussion with David Flick, just wanted to touch on finally on the issue of the use of the Australian Defence Force in combating the virus. That's been an issue which has been touched on in the public debate, but not thoroughly explored. And I think that it is something that does require some scrutiny from a constitutional standpoint, certainly from a public policy standpoint, because it is the power of the Commonwealth under Section 1 to deploy the Defence Force to state police forces. It's something that's occurred only very rarely. I was some reporting which suggested that it had happened only 3 times in the history of Federation or the Commonwealth. And in fact, on only one of those occasions did that result in actual defence personnel on the ground assisting with policing. I think the Morrison government has adopted a measured response. The decision not to involve Defence Force personnel in enforcement of fines related to COVID-19, I think is a good step. But nevertheless, it does raise, I think, significant issues. Additionally, before I hand over to you, John, for your thoughts, a lot of criticism has been levelled at the Victorian government for not requesting Defence Force personnel to assist some of our quarantining. And a lot of people, or some people, have called for the federal government to send in troops over the wishes of Victoria. The federal government's resisted those urges, and I think that is wholly the right decision. It would be, I think, putting aside the terrible situation in Victoria at the moment, with over 200 cases yesterday of virus, putting that aside, I think it would be a very dangerous precedent for the Commonwealth Government to send in troops against the wishes of the state, and I think wholly inconsistent with the constitutional framework. John, do you have any thoughts on any of those issues?
Certainly, and good comment, Xavier. I have, like a lot of people, reservations about the use of Defence Force personnel beyond a supporting role. We've always had a natural and a very healthy, not scepticism, but certainly a healthy reservation about the use of the military for civilian purposes. I support, I should say, the use of the military for civilian purposes, but it must be, as I said a moment ago, to support efforts by state governments. If you then open up the opportunity for federal governments, present and future, to be able to override the resistance of a state to request the support of military personnel. And it happens in various different natural disaster type situations. It's not so uncommon, but it's always been very tentatively done, in that there's always been a respect and a determination to ensure that all military resources are subject to civilian authority. If you're coming in over the top of a state, and traditionally the use of ADF personnel has always been at the request of the state, there are very limited opportunities for the Commonwealth to take any kind of unilateral action. In fact, the only opportunities for unilateral action for the ADF in civilian type purposes is where you have a state that is experiencing effectively political collapse, and we've never been close to that. So it is very important, as you say, Zave, to make sure that I think ADF personnel are used when requested by a state and subject to all the normal civilian officers that would oversee the use of those resources.
Thanks, John. I see there's a bit of discussion in the chat about the tension between originalism and textualism. I might touch on that briefly before I introduce David Flint and commence my discussion with him. Thanks very much for joining us, John, and thanks for your insights. I'm not sure if you can stick around for the rest of the discussion, John, but we'd certainly love to have you. But as I said, turning to the discussion of originalism and textualism, it's something which we've been discussing a fair bit recently in the society, and certainly I've been putting a lot of thought into it. I actually wrote a paper on the subject for one of my final law exams, and was prompted to think about that paper with the recent Bostock decision in the United States. And for what it's worth, and this is my own personal view, it's not necessarily reflective of a settled position on the part of the society. I do think that it is very important when we are talking about originalism and that originalist framework to consider the original meaning of words used in the context of the intent, the original intent of the people who authored those words. Because I think the danger, and we see this a lot in Victoria, there were a number of decisions in the time leading into my role advising John that showed the way in which judicial activists can use like originalist arguments, textualist arguments to pervert or usurp the meaning of statutes. Walter's decision in Victoria and the Bolton decision in Victoria being two such cases. And I think the danger of an overly textual approach is that it does create those opportunities. Words, although we'd like to think of them as having fixed meanings, are often defined in many different ways. So you pick up 3 different dictionaries and find a dozen different definitions of most given words. And to look at that without looking at the intent of Parliament drafting legislation or the founders drafting the Constitution is, in my view, to miss the point. When we're interpreting the Constitution, what we should be interested in is the federal compact that the Australian people who, like the people of America, at the time of the adoption of the US Constitution, were very well educated and well versed in those matters, those that voted. And there was a high level of participation in politics there. And so, we can look to the convention debates, we can look to the information that we have about Sir Samuel Griffiths and the other drafters' intentions from those debates and from other materials that are contemporaneous to assess what meant by those words, rather than adopting a modern interpretation of words with provisions to suit the particular aspirations of the judge or set of judges. That, as I said, is my view on the dangers of strict technicalism or literalism, as I call it, and, as I said, the need for original intent to be considered. And I think that's totally consistent with the Westminster tradition that Australia has adopted and has benefited from immensely, particularly the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, supremacy, which is the key tenet. That brings me, I think, very nicely into my discussion with you, Professor Flint, because you argue that Australia is, more than any other nation in the world, the offspring of both the United Kingdom and the United States. I touched on the UK, the Western tradition just now, and I think that that's fairly understandable. But for those who are unfamiliar with the Australian system, why do you say that we are an offspring of the United States?
Well, I think our founders were particularly impressed by the United States, and some of them wanted to go as far as the United States, even, for example, in having an executive presidency or some executive head of state. But that was something which most of them would not go so far as. So we have the English system of responsible government, but in many respects we have institutions borrowed from the United States. The Senate, for example, the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, when they were looking, and this is relevant, I think, to what you're saying, when they were looking at the American Supreme Court, they seemed to have a gap in their information. They didn't seem to be aware of the problem that Dred Scott created, which Lincoln addressed, and the very idea that a Supreme Court should have the power to determine what the Constitution means without any restriction whatsoever was something which amazed the American founders. And they went along with it, and the Supreme Court did not really misbehave until Dred Scott. But there was also Plessy and Ferguson, which preserved segregation. There were cases in the Supreme Court which went very much against the standards of industrial law, which we would expect as normal in Australia. It's very strange that our founders brought that over. The other thing I'd like to mention, and there's been talk about the Bill of Rights, remember that the Americans only have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution because it was the only way to bring all of the original colonies into the Federation, into the Union. And they would not have come in but for that. And that was only there. There were rights generally accepted, but that was only there to restrict the power of the central government. It has been, to an extent, misinterpreted.
Absolutely, Professor. And I was watching with my partner the other evening, the in my opinion, and this may offend some people, that shocking musical Hamilton, which really does an injustice to founders. And the way that musical makes it sound like Hamilton was the great proponent of the Constitution and he secured its adoption completely misses the fact that it was James Madison drafting those amendments to limit the power of the central government to protect states. That was the reason that it was adopted. So you're entirely correct there, Professor. And I think, as John mentioned, it is quite disingenuous of some who are proponents of the Charter in Australia at a national level, try and make arguments based on that without that critical context that it's about protecting the people and the states from what may otherwise have been too strong a central government. I think that's an excellent observation.
May I say I agree with you and John over the current crisis and the extraordinary exercise of power, particularly through this National cabinet, which has no formal legal existence, and the use of power without explanation. And I think that people should bear in mind the decision in the live cattle export case recently by Justice Rares in the federal court, where he's found that the Commonwealth minister who took such extreme measures, there was no need for a total cattle ban, just as with only 13 people in Australia in intensive care because of the virus, there's no need to go into a panic and believe modelling which comes from the Imperial College, from Professor Lockdown in the Imperial College in London. I think we have to be more restrained, and governments do have to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think that there seem to be many examples of a serious misfeasance in public office, which will, I agree with John, which will lead to massive claims. Unfortunately, it'll be the taxpayer who will pay for those claims.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. We've got a number of questions and comments from the chat, and I'll touch on a couple of them. One question from Joshua, which I think is a great question, is whether a past generation's decisions can viably bind a future generation. In other words, why should we preference the views of the founders over those of today? I want to comment on that briefly, and then Professor Flynn, I might throw over to you because I'm sure you've got an opinion about that too. For what it's worth, from my perspective, and I have written a little bit about this in the past, the idea that we're going to rely on a group of people to determine our political and legal system is obviously not flawed. People are imperfect. And it's going to be always possible to find criticism of any system devised by people. That's true. However, the virtue of an originalist perspective framework, in my view, is that it leaves those questions as largely settled and takes them out of the political debate. So it allows us to have a framework for our political system based on fundamental values and principles. Normally, these are minimal, they're limited. Constitutions deal with the big ticket items rather than dealing with all sorts of periphery. And it gives us a framework to start our discussion and our debate. Certainly, if there are issues that arise over time, there is an amendments process. And that process can correct or account for certain issues. But rather than leaving our foundational principles of constant debate, constant discussion, constant contestation, an originalist framework gives us a solid foundation. And I think that's critical when we're thinking about the rule of law, liberal democratic values. It's much more preferable that than the alternative, which might be something that looks like the Chaz in Seattle or failed states around the world, like Venezuela or North Korea, where they do not have these same principles. In Venezuela, for example, they have a constant system of rewriting their constitution through national people's processes, and we only need to look at the results. That's my take on it. Professor Flint, do you have a view?
Certainly. Ours is a living constitution, but not in the way activist American judges mean. Ours is a living constitution because we have in it, as you rightly pointed out, a process for having the constitution changed by the people. Unfortunately, it can only be initiated by the federal parliament. The South Australian Premier wanted a much broader power, but that wasn't given. But the fact is, and I've checked on this, there are about a half dozen powers where the people have said more than once, sometimes up to 5 times, no, we don't want you to give that power to Canberra. Canberra is not to have that power. Now, in every instance, and I find this extraordinary, in every instance, all of those powers have effectively been handed over to Canberra by interpretations by the High Court. And in the workplace case where it was pointed out, it was argued, you really can't have this power going to the Commonwealth. The judges said, well, we don't really know what the people meant in that particular referendum, whether they considered this. the judges completely dismissed the several decisions of the people asked in referendums whether that power should go to Canberra. And unfortunately, the High Court then, by majority, decided that that legislation was valid, although the people had made it very clear they didn't want that power to go to Canberra. I think it's very important in Australia to remember that we're not just exercising or living under a constitution which is, as critics say, a horse and buggy constitution. What on earth you'd say about the American Constitution, which is twice as old, I don't know, and certainly a superb constitution. But we do have the process of change. It was never intended that the Supreme Court, the High Court, should have the power of unilateral changes unaccountable by unelected men and women.
Absolutely, that's an excellent observation, Professor. There are two issues I want to ask you about arising from that discussion. We'll come back to judicial activism. But first, it's probably well known amongst Australians, although for our international viewers it may not be, that you chaired the No campaign in the 1999 Republic referendum. And that was at a time when most of the mainstream and the mainstream media were arguing in favour of the referendum. So that was a courageous decision, if I can say, on your part. Tell us why you did so.
Well, Xavier, thank you. There were three reasons. First, on several occasions, I had been called upon to swear an oath of allegiance. I think if you put your hand on the Bible and you swear an oath, as you do in court, you should observe that, unless there are such great grounds that you have to break your oath. And I saw no grounds to break my oath. Secondly, I have a very high regard for the Queen. I think she has performed superbly, and I think she does provide leadership above politics, as does the system of constitutional monarchy. That's not to say that I don't think that the American system is superb too. But the third reason I was opposed was the highly flawed republic which was being offered. It was a republic in which the Prime Minister, the only example of such a republic, the Prime Minister could sack the President without grounds, without notice, and without any right of appeal. In other words, the President would become the puppet of the Prime Minister. It would increase the powers of the Prime Minister and of the Cabinet. And one of the weaknesses of the Westminster system, the constitutional monarchy, which emerged after and in many ways because of the American Revolution, is that it's broken the separation of powers. It's damaged the separation of powers because we no longer have a separate executive from a separate legislature. The lower house controls the government of the day. The government of the day must have the confidence of the lower house, which only emerged in the 19th century in Britain. You need some check and balance on that. And that check and balance in our system, as we saw in 1975, are the reserved powers of the Crown. You've got to have either. You've got to have the American system or you've got to have our system. These are the wisdom of the Anglo-Saxon world, which is at the top in relation to politics, while Italy is at the top in relation to music and cuisine, which the English aren't. But the Anglo-Saxon system is very good in relation to constitutions. And we have two alternatives. We have the American model and we have the British model. You've got to go with either one of them. Unfortunately, the American model has never lasted long when it's been exported. Even the French in 1848, they adopted essentially the American model. Within 4 years, they had a dictatorship under Napoleon III. The American model doesn't seem to export well. The British model did export well. It worked very well in a number of Arab countries, incidentally, until the army overthrew the constitutional monarchies in the Arab world.
Now, we had a question earlier which touched on the engineers' decision in the 1920s. And the question essentially asks, the court has adopted a view since then that's been largely consistent. It's been a textualist view. It's been inconsistent with originalism. And so is there any hope of reverting things or arresting the decline? I might touch on that shortly, but I did want to ask you, again, as I mentioned before, about judicial activism. And I think that engineer's case is a prime example of judicial activism. I think the context that is so often not appreciated about the dynamics, Sir Isaac Isaacs, and the way that he was able to outlive his political or ideological opponents. He lost the convention debates, but he managed to outlive those opponents and get his way in the end through judicial activism. And I think that we've been paying an enormous price since then. You also say that judicial activism has come at an enormous cost in the US and in Australia. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Well, the intention of the Constitution was that certain powers be reserved to the states. That was confirmed in the Union Label case. The original founders who sat on the High Court repeated that. And you're quite right, by the time of the engineers case, Sir Isaac Isaacs had his way, which he couldn't have at the convention. He had his way and began the process, the trend, which has been irreversible, that is to give more and more powers to Canberra. The result has been appalling for the Australian people. The Federation is damaged, severely damaged. And I think the Toomey-Withers report, which I think was in about 2006, demonstrated the cost of that. Ours is the most fiscally centralized federation among comparable countries. About 80% of taxes are collected by the Commonwealth, half of that given back to the states, but with instructions on how to spend it, with the Commonwealth interfering in a number of state powers, for example, education, the result of which we've seen a significant decline in the standards of education in Australia. Now, the Toomey-Withers report said they tried to work out the cost of this compared with, say, Switzerland or Germany or some of the other federations which are far less centralized than ours. And they came out with a costing of about 10%. That's not 10% once, that's 10% per annum. The cost of duplication and the fact that things don't work as well when you have two powers trying to run them. And the cost to us, the cost to the Australian people is about $160 billion a year. Now, imagine what we could do with that over a number of years. If we were more like Switzerland, where the central government doesn't have the same powers, doesn't exercise the same powers, we would have that. Nothing is gained by this excessive centralism. In fact, I often ask people when I speak whether I'm wrong in saying this, and nobody can indicate a single issue where I am wrong. And I say, I think it's a fact that in Australia, there is no significant problem which, if it were not created by the governments, has been made significantly worse by them. And people cannot point to a significant problem. Even bushfires, which are exacerbated by the way in which the governments allow the fuel loads in the national parks. We have a series of problems, most of which are created by not only the disturbance of the Federation, the abandonment of the Federation, but a system in which the politicians are unaccountable and the judges are unaccountable. I can only see a solution in making the judges and politicians more accountable to the ordinary people of Australia, many of whom have much more common sense than our rulers.
Well, didn't Ronald Reagan say that the scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help"? Professor, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think we may have time for one more question I've been burning to ask you. And that is on the same subject of judicial activism. What, in your view, are some of the best and worst decisions of the US Supreme Court and the High Court of Australia?
Well, I think in Australia, the best one was the Union Label case, which confirmed reserved powers. But I think the worst was the engineers case, not because of itself, not because of just the case, but the trend it created. It seems to be irreversible. And now in the United States, starting out with Dred Scott, Plessy and Ferguson, the cases concerning trade unions, Korematsu, which meant that anybody of Japanese descent could be detained during the war, even if they were American citizens, and Roe v. Wade, which invented a right to abortion. I'm not saying there shouldn't be some rights to abortion, but these are state matters. This is not a matter within the Bill of Rights. And I'm still trying to think of the best decision of the United States Supreme Court. I can't see one at the moment.
Well, there's certainly, I think that's a great analysis. Demden and Petter, I think for me, stands out as an early case of the court, which I think was excellent. But
Yes.
we've sadly not seen a court that has interpreted the Constitution in the way it was intended in such a way since then. And as you pointed out, I think it's negligent that we had the drafters of the Constitution on the High Court. They gave us a framework of exactly what they meant, and
Yes.
we've decided to just throw that away. And
Just one matter, if
Yes.
I may raise one, I think one of the best decisions, it wasn't a constitutional decision, but a very correct decision, was Pell and the Queen. And that is, it overthrew the decision of the Court of Appeal in Victoria, which is really guilt by accusation. They adopted the guilt by accusation doctrine, and the High Court resumed. Surprisingly to me, unanimously, not just by a majority, they restored the rule that in criminal cases, guilt must be established beyond reasonable doubt. And we can't have a situation under the rule of law where crimes or serious offences can be proved otherwise than by proving beyond reasonable doubt.
Absolutely. I think that in terms of contemporary legal issues more broadly, I think that is certainly a very consequential case. And if we look at what's happening in the United States, and it looks like there may be a danger of that happening in Australia too, certainly a case that stands for the age.
Well, just coming in from the Sydney office here, obviously this has been a fantastic, terrific conversation. We really thank you for taking the time. But unfortunately, we're at the end of our time and we're starting the next breakout. So to anyone who would like to stick around, have a conversation, I'm about to unmute everybody. Speakers, you are also free to stick around or you may leave, whatever is your preference. But I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, to be a part of the conference. It was a fascinating conversation. And I hope that we will see you soon.